So my name is Charlotte. I'm a master's student at Sciences Po's Urban School, and I'm just really excited to see so many people here tonight. And so, just welcome to people here in the room and also the people joining us online. I'll just share with you maybe a little bit about why we chose this image of the snail on our flyers, just because snail kind of represents, slowing down, which is one of the values of degrowth. And it's a picture I took in Copenhagen a few months ago. I was able to visit Christiania, which was a squatted military base in the 1970s and is still, standing today. And I think it exemplifies a lot of the values and principles of degrowth in terms of like renovating and adapting existing buildings instead of tearing them down. Prioritizing like human relations over market relations and just really focusing on more, sharing and togetherness. And so this evening, we're just super excited to welcome Timothée Parrique, who is a French economist who focuses on degrowth. So he finished his PhD in 2019. It was called the Political Economy of Degrowth, and currently he's based at Lund University in Sweden, doing research on how to fund welfare systems in post-growth societies. And we're so excited that his book came out last week, Ralentir ou périr, l'économie de la décroissance. So he's in France for a few weeks to share and talk about his book. So it's just great to see it's interesting. So many people are interested in this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Benjamin. I'm a student in my second year of master's in the Urban and Territorial Strategies master's here in the Urban School. This event is organized as part of Situ, which is the Urban School Student Association. And at the Urban School, we're always thinking about societal challenges applied to cities, climate change and its impacts, and a wide range of other questions. And it was quite natural, seeing the context that we're in today, hearing more and more about degrowth sobriety applied to energy and other issues. It was quite obvious for us to take interest in this issue and try to invite someone to tell us more about it. So we're really excited to try to link also at some point in this evening degrowth and cities. So the way this evening is going to be carried out is Timothée is going to give his presentation at first, then we'll move into a more interactive moment. And after that, there will be an open Q&A session for you all to ask questions. Just as a way to get started, maybe to get everyone thinking about what degrowth means, we'd like you guys to connect to WooClap if you can on your smartphones, and just put on the app, the first thing that comes to mind when you hear degrowth or when you think about degrowth. So just one word. Okay, decomposition, okay. A lot of people answering this is moving fast. Okay, degrowth is the future. Nice. Okay, so I see a lot of people seem to be acquired to the cause in a sense. That's my interpretation. Okay, interesting. I think, okay, we've got a lot of different, so I don't know if, can we take like a screenshot? So maybe we'll take a screenshot and see how your ideas change compared to afterwards. I guess degrowth means a lot of things for different people, but I think, yeah, I think we see it can mean a lot of things, and maybe it can be interesting for Timothée to bring his take on it. So Timothée, I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Fantastic to be here. Do you know why the symbol of the degrowth movement is the snail? The not only has to do with the fact that the snail is the symbol of slowness and of minimalism, of just being able to carry all your stuff in your tiny little shell, but also because of a quote from Austrian-French philosopher Ivan Illich from 1982, where Illich had this interesting idea of, probably after reading a book about snails, realized that snails build up their shells in, these spirals that increase in size exponentially. So the snail builds it up and up and up, but at some point the snail decides to stop. If it were to build another round, his shell would actually just get enormous. So at that point, the snails decide to stop growing and go in reverse. So it goes back in order to reinforce the solidity of its shell through cycles of degrowth. And so back then, Ivan Illich thought, what a nice analogy to talk about, to make the divide between growth and development to be like societies can grow up to a point, and after that decide that they've reached some kind of sweet spot in terms of scale and decide to focus on qualitative improvement, on reproductive capacities, on sustainability. So that's a bit on the idea of the snail. Now here is the beast. On the left, I introduced to you my beloved first child, PhD thesis, born after 3 years and 10 months of pain, tears and blood. 500,000 words of theoretical economics in English, freely available on the PDF online. If you have nothing to do this weekend, I highly recommend it. It's a thrilling read. Or I've been working the last 2 years in shrinking and degrowing and minimalizing and downscaling and decreasing and reducing is diminishing that humongous beast into this snail-like 311 pages synthesis in French of the argument. So tonight, I'm not going to talk about the entirety of the degrowth field. I have decided to present to you a definition of degrowth, which sounds extremely arrogant because of all the people that have studied degrowth. Famously, even Serge Latouche and Paul Ariès and Pierre Rabhi and Michel Lepezon and many other people that came into the degrowth field. Degrowth has always been a concept so complex and multifaceted and plastic that offering a definition is a risky business. In the book, I've offered one. The book came out last Friday, so I haven't received any death threat yet. But I'm hoping for you to tell me whether that definition is convincing. I was hoping something would happen as I pressed that. Yes, I see. So that's degrowth, and I've grabbed when you guys were doing this word clouding, I've seen the word losers, I've seen the word eco-terrorism, I've seen the word regression, and let me tell you, that is cute compared to what I have to deal with working on degrowth. That is very small, but look at the right. Magical thinking. Cares more about rhinoceroses than about people. Conspiracy theorist. Warring proposal. Misleading and dangerous. Thriving monastic lives. Back to pre-industrial living standards. Where is my little favorite? It's collapse born addict. It's somewhere in there. So degrowth is in that very strange situation where, as you can see on the left, many media, even politicians and people always like bring up the word, have to position themselves, and the media are getting curious, being like, something is going on around degrowth. What the hell is that? And on the other hand, you have a wave of hatred towards the word. Like it really feels like the the most dangerous concept in economics, and something that anyone that is being serious about economics has to say, you know, degrowth is crap, is a dangerous idea. I'm a serious economist and I tell you that's nonsense. That's also something we have with our prime ministers in France. It seems to be almost a ritual. If you're elected prime minister, one of the first things you must do is to say that degrowth is nonsense. It's maybe a drinking game among government. I have no idea. So what I want to do here is to offer a bit of rigor to at least define what that mysterious object of degrowth is. And then we can decide whether it is for losers, whether it is ecotourism, whether it is regression, or if, and that will be the idea I'll be defending, degrowth is a pretty cool concept that we cannot do without. So first, a little historical contextualization. When we talk about degrowth, we are actually encapsulating 3 layers of concept. First, an objection to growth. That objection to growth is 50 years old, comes from the 70s. We remember now the limits to growth from 1972 and the work back then of other people like Ernest Frederick Schumacher and A Small is Beautiful, Marilyn Waring, the New Zealand, the economist from New Zealand and her criticism of national accounting, the work of Herman Daly, of Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen on entropy. So back then in the 1970s, people started to realize that somehow exponential growth is impossible on a finite planet. It was a worry projected into the future. If we continue to produce and consume without limits, at some point, there's going to be an ecological problem. That was the ancestry of the concept. Fast forward to 2002, and a bunch of French thinkers that coined the term décroissance soutenable, sustainable degrowth. And their logic was the following. That was a moment where the concept of sustainable development was getting very cool. And they're like, talking about sustainable development at the level of the planet, sustainable development for Madagascar, sustainable development for Luxembourg, felt like one single concept to rule them all was not doing the job. And building on the objection to growth, if we're facing some kind of unsurmountable biophysical limits, then the sustainable development of the global south and of countries who still need to produce and consume more to satisfy their needs will require energy and resources. And so therefore, we need sustainable degrowth in early industrialized old capitalist economies, high-income countries, the minority world, the global north, in order to enable prosperity in the global south. And in making this argument, people at the beginning of the 2000s realized that it was just not enough to worry about the potential hitting the ecological boundaries, because in the 2000s in a country like France, we already could witness the overshoot of planetary boundaries. So now it was just not enough to worry. It was just, we had to organize this biophysical diet that is degrowth. And so that idea gathered a lot of attention. I don't know why. Back then, people found the concept pretty cool. So in 2006, they founded a political party in France on degrowth. This is journals and books, and the concept came to Catalonia, to Spain, to Italy, to Quebec, to Switzerland, to Belgium. People gathered around at book clubs, wrote articles. The media started to get curious. Pierre Rabhi launched his presidential campaign in 2002 on the concept of degrowth. So there was some agitation around the concept. In 2008, degrowth, décroissance was translated in English with the organization of the first international conference in Paris. And the first definition of degrowth was offered. And back then, that was the beginning of the expansion of the concept into the English world, the birth of degrowth as a field of study. So now I'm a degrowth scholar. So I'm an economist, I'm an ecological economist, but the main concept I work with and my specialty is degrowth. I'm not the only one. There are professors, postdoc, PhD students, master students that just specialized on that topic. Degrowth in mobility, degrowth in food, the history of the concept of degrowth, macroeconomic modeling, and in my current case, the financing of the welfare state under degrowing conditions. So it has become a growing field of studies. There are now around 600 articles in English on the topic. And that's a wealth we don't quite find in political debates or when you open the media, especially in France, because most of that literature is in English. And most French people, well, you know. So degrowth, that phase, the biophysical diet, the shrinking, the focusing not only on what had to be done biophysically, but also what had to be done in terms of institutional reform. And more than that, in terms of changes in the social imaginary. Because of course, you cannot reduce production and consumption in a society that has heralded economic growth as the totem of civilization. So that's the famous catchphrase of Serge Latouche: we must decolonize our social imaginary from the pursuit of economic growth. And so under the term degrowth came a lot of older critique of extractivism, productivism, commercialism, consumerism, how did I call it in the thesis? Cannot be that old. Extractivism, excretionism. That doesn't sound right. Anyway, neoliberalism as well. And a package of ideologies, even the ideology of development with this Western capitalocentric focus. So all of those people rallied behind degrowth as the kind of what Paul Ariès was calling a missile word, something that created a dissensus. Like you spoke about degrowth and some people were just bothered and other people excited. So that was perfect for a debate. I think we're here still. You talk about degrowth. I was teaching a course at HEC this morning, and you're asking people who think degrowth is necessary, and you get like 50% of the people are going to raise their hands, and then the other half is just thinking precisely the opposite, which for me is the sign that it's a useful concept. If you have a concept that everyone agrees on, like circular economy, like well-being, like the common good economy, like the positive economy, like the circular economy, like sustainable development, like the green economy, it's a useless concept because it has no transformative power. A concept that you introduce where you have people against is a concept that runs against the system. If we agree that we must transform the system today, we need concept that bite. We need concept that bother. We need this ideological itch concept you drop in a conversation and people feel a bit awkward. So in that sense, degrowth is just my jam. Third layer, objection to growth. Of course, they're cumulative. So the degrowth of the 2000 integrate the objection to growth, but just move it a bit further. And then post-growth. Post-growth is degrowth realizing that, yeah, okay, we will have this transition. We need to do the diet and we need to change the institutions and create all the new imaginary in order to just help us during this big transition. But what after? And so post-growth is the utopia. What happens after we have escaped the imaginary of growth, the growth system, the growth-based economy? You could also say post-capitalism. They go together because capitalism cannot prosper without growth. So you want to escape growth, you have to escape capitalism necessarily. And so post-growth has developed into its own literature attached to degrowth. So now when we refer to it, we often say degrowth and post-growth together. And in the book, now what I'm going to do is to go point by point, and in 10 sentences, I'm going to define both degrowth and post-growth in the way they're articulated. And I've got 26 minutes and 39 seconds to do that. So that's it. Sorry for the French. That's from the content, but you can see that chapter 6 and chapter 7 is structured in a definition. So that's a definition in 10 points where I detail I've made it modular. I think that was the problem in the degrowth literature, is that it was just offered in bulk. Either you take the bag or you don't. But that is why I think it has a popularity problem, because people felt a bit shy to take all of it. I think now what we need is just lay down the tools, like show us the toolbox. And then we're like, oh, this I like, this I don't like, this I like, this I don't like. And then we go, this I agree with, this I disagree. This is for losers. This is the eco-terrorism part. But this I like, this is the softening, well-being future part. We'll find out who wrote those words. It's just a matter of time. The door is closed and you cannot run and you cannot hide. So let's start with degrowth. A reduction of production and consumption. At this point, it is important to say that degrowth is the same as a recession. And I know that I've spent about 30 pages in my thesis arguing fiercely that it's not. But now it strikes me that for clarity, I think we should begin by saying that an economy can do three things at the macroeconomic level. You know, it can grow, can degrow, can remain in a steady state. If we admit that the economy is just too big now in terms of proportion, that we produce and consume too much, then we need to reduce production and consumption. First line. That's like what you observe. It's the concrete phenomenon of degrowth. Of course, it is done for a reason. So you're not gonna knock at the door of people writing books about degrowth and tell them they have to halve their production. You have to just focus on reducing production and consumption with high ecological intensities. Why do we need to do this? Then maybe some of you have studied economics and will be like, we don't need to degrow because we can green growth. You can try. There will be a question time. You can try. You can have your best shot. I've been spending the last few years diving pretty deep into these numbers, and I can tell you there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Bottom line, and that's pretty much what you can read in the last IPCC report, we can green some part of the economy in certain countries, but usually quite slowly and just from a few selected environmental pressures, never from all environmental interactions. And we can do this to a certain extent. And usually that extent, not usually all the time, that extent is always insufficient to what we need to do to feed back our fat high-income economies into sustainable planetary boundaries. Hence the need for degrowth. Here, there's a burden of proof problem. Environmental economists often argue that, okay, guys, you want to show that degrowth is an ecological solution? Show us the numbers. But I'm like, no, I mean, that doesn't work like this. We argue that somehow reducing production and consumption is likely to reduce the use of natural resources. They argue that producing more will reduce the use of natural resources. So who should have the burden of proof? So in the report, Decoupling Debunked, I wrote with colleagues based on my thesis in 2009, we passed the burden of proof to environmental economists. And since then, it's only been a very lonely symphony of silence on their part. So I think it is high time, and the chapter 2 of that book will be my last writing on the topic of decoupling, to consider that, quote unquote, and I'm being kind, theory falsified. So we must acknowledge the fact that we will have to reduce some kinds of production and consumption. And if we want to do that, then we have to select the ones that are most intensive based on the environmental pressures we want to reduce. A recession happens chaotically. It is an accident, an economy that runs on growth that doesn't manage to grow anymore. It's like a bike that loses its speed and then you're just wobbling and fall. Degrowth, on the opposite, would be best if it were to be planned. It needs to be planned because a recession is cutting production and consumption, not based on happiness, well-being footprints and ecological footprints, but quite randomly. What we want is a diet, not an amputation. If you want to lose 20 kilos, you can go for runs and think about your diet, or you can just slice your leg off. The difference between a recession and degrowth is precisely this, the difference between an amputation and pain and a diet. We'll get back to why we need to do this democratically, or actually we'll not get back, we'll do it now. Why do that democratically? Because if you want to plan any cut into what an economy produces and consumes, how do you make that call? You have to draw a line between essential and superfluous productions and consumptions, are actually a priority between what you could afford to reduce and the kind of stuff you don't want to reduce. Who's going to decide that? Economists will never be able to just put like well-being footprints on product and just order them and make the cut for people. So if we admit that somehow this degrowth transition is to be organized around the maintenance of well-being, then we necessarily must plan it democratically. In a spirit of social justice. So now these terms seems a bit odd in English. That's because it's a French definition translated straight into English, because I didn't want it to change the order. But on the English version, I'll work a bit more so that it's a bit smoother. In the spirit of social justice, again, it's important. Why? Because we're not going to degrow global South economies. That would make no sense. I mean, you remember the Avengers. Thanos is gathering all the Infinity Stones to close his fist and suppress half of the population of the universe to save the resources, but it would not work. I mean, if I were like Thanos' chief economist, if you accept me, I'll be like, Mr. Thanos, be serious. I mean, let me give you like just focus on 10% richest in the universe, and then you will be so much more effective. So degrowth, see it like this, it's a specific diet for countries that are in situation of ecological overshoot. Consider myself a macroeconomist specialized in ecological obesity. So I focus on the US, on Canada, on Australia, on France, on Luxembourg, on Sweden, on high-income countries. I focus in shrinking their metabolism in order to liberate as much resources to create a fair shot, not only for the life of future generations and non-humans, but also most urgently for the well-being of people in the global South that currently cannot yet satisfy their needs. So it's geographically selective, but even if we look at France, it needs to be selective because we need to look at emissions and pressures where they are. And they are just correlated with income and wealth. You've heard these numbers, 50%, half of global emissions are caused by the consumption of the 10% richest. If you look in the European Union, same kind of relation, the absolute emissions of the poorest half of the European Union is the same amount in ton that the emissions of the 10% richest. Even at the scale of a single country like France, you see a sweet correlation between income and emissions. So degrowth will have to be doubly selective, triply selective, geographically, concerning which goods and services, and concerning what kind of classes of consumers. So here it complexifies this, but we need complex concept. That's precisely why it's interesting today, because it's more complex, it's more precise than sustainable development. And I finish with this, while improving well-being. So here, that is what my colleague Jason Hickel calls the happy coincidence of degrowth. What we need to do to survive is also what we need to do to thrive. And that the idea that somehow in high-income economies, well-being has for long been decoupled, dissociated, disconnected, decorrelated from measures of well-being. Health standards, levels of trust, happiness indicators, life expectancy, quality of democracy, quality of public services, all of these indicators past a certain threshold of GDP per capita, you can press your GDP button as much as you want. That's not going to improve these standards. In a country like France, the eradication of poverty, for example, or the quality of public services depends on allocation qualitative, institutional changes. It's not just a matter of production. We don't have homeless people in France because we don't have enough homes. We don't have people that go hungry because we don't have enough food. It's just at the macroeconomic level, we have rules that prevent these people from accessing a wealth that already exists. And so if we want to improve these social aspects, we need to work on somehow the qualitative distribution and not of the quantitative scale of the economy. So there is this beautiful sunset. There is a possibility somehow to look at a country like the US with an extremely fat biophysical metabolism and somehow shrink part of it in reorganizing the economy while maintaining or even improving well-being. If you compare health standards in the US compared to health standards in France, we're healthier here in France. But the size of our health sector is smaller than the one in the US in GDP terms. If the US were to switch to a French kind of healthcare, that and nothing else changes, they would see their GDP decrease, but they would see their health standards increase. So in that sense, there's a lot we can start thinking about reducing production and consumption, having this as a consequence of an observed reduction of GDP and not necessarily seeing this as a social regression. So that's the definition of degrowth. It's one first line and concrete phenomenon you can observe, and then 4 elements: sustainability, democracy, justice, well-being. See this as a kind of compass for the transition. And now what I want to do is articulate this transitional concept, this temporary action. We need to put an economy into degrowth mode until we manage to get back under planetary boundaries. But then what happens? You don't degrow until you get out of existence. Then we switch to something that is even cooler than degrowth, and believe me, it's difficult. Into a utopia, which is strange to talk about utopia today. I mean, as an economist, we've been for decades training economists to be the nice little obedient dentist of capitalism, you know, nicely, kindly filling cavities, putting band-aids with little cute taxes and stuff like this. But we've lost our ability to become architect of new economies. I often do this thought experiment with my students of just having to create an economy from scratch, from the bottom up on a blank page of paper. That is something difficult, but that is something we should be able to do as an economist, being engineers of potentially better economies. And so what I wanted to do in the book is create a narrative, a destination, educate our desire for a post-capitalist, post-productivist, post-consumerist, post-commercialist, post-growth, to say for short, economy. And so that's what I'm going to do now with the concept of post-growth. So bear with me. We had our economy that was obese, was too big, had to be shrunk. And so we're having this transition, and we're managing to downscale the size of the economy to a level that is ecologically sustainable. Now the goal is to avoid that the economy get back into growth mode and overreach again planetary boundaries. So what we need is a steady state economy. That concept comes from Herman Daly in the 1970s. So an economy is in a steady state in terms of metabolism. Like me, I've been in a steady state. I'm still 1.80 m and roughly the same weight. I've been for the last 10 years, but I've had qualitative development. So for a macroeconomy would be the same. The metabolism is the same, but of course, the essence of what's being produced and consumed changes. And you can have fluctuation based on needs. So if something happens like a tornado and that destroys a lot of your housing, of course, you will need to agitate yourself. You will see more economic activity to rebuild. But once that rebuilding is done, you don't want to see an exponential growth of building activities forever. So that's the idea of a steady state that is kind of fluctuating based on needs. And we'll come back to that. So now the way I'm going to build this definition is in symmetry with the one of degrowth. So that is a kind of like concrete phenomenon, a steady state economy, just like degrowth is a reduction of production and consumption. And now I'm going to add the very same 4 principles, the 4 values: sustainability, democracy, justice, and well-being. I'm going to add them, but of course they're going to take a different form, because now we're not just into diet mode, we're thinking the functioning of a long-term economy. So the way I phrased it is, we're not talking about lightening footprint, which is a very diet kind of thing to do. We want the economy to remain in harmony with nature. The concept that has struck with me the most when I wrote the thesis was the idea of German sociologist Hartmut Rosa's theory of social acceleration and resonance. So our relation with time, and see economic growth as the kind of acceleration of economic activity. This is why I went for the concept of slow down in the book, because I think it's quite clear. So let's see harmony as ecosystems. They have what we call carrying capacities. They're like a lift that can hold, 6 people, 500 kilos. If you put 2 tons in them, they're going to break. If you have a fish, the fish population is going to disappear. If you pollute, you acidify the ocean, the coral reef is going to die. If you emit too much carbon in the atmosphere, climate is going to warm up. These kind of thresholds. So we have to respect the speed limits of nature that is giving us an ecological ceiling. It gives us a pace for our economy. If you discover a new resource, if you manage to recycle something better than before, it opens up potential production. You're not forced to produce more. Again, if it corresponds to a need, you can do that. If it doesn't correspond to a need, then it's fine. We can manage to preserve more and more natural resources into national parks, or to save resources for other countries that might need them more than us to use. So this idea of harmony is not only this utilitarian management-like vision of nature, but trying to re-embed economic life within a larger community of living beings. So when I was doing my PhD thesis, I've read a lot into the Buen Vivir literature. That's the only time you could listen to my Spanish accent, so I hope you enjoyed it. And in that literature, people talk about, an extended community. And for me, that inspired me a lot. So in the book, I developed this into a concept of ecological sympathy, to be like, how would you organize your economy if you were to minimize harm to other beings? Which is an interesting thought experiment I sometimes do. Try to imagine how we would organize provisioning activities in the city of Paris if we wanted to minimize the death of snails, or the death of birds, or the death of trees, that kind of stuff. So that forces us somehow to take into account the well-being of non-humans in the way we were not doing before. So that's one way of thinking about harmony in a post-growth fashion that is a bit less utilitarian than our diet, where decisions are taken together. This is a principle of democracy. So if we plan a transition democratically, why not extend that principle into the day-to-day functioning of the economy? So now when I say this, planning, rationing, now people, you're thinking of just, meat vouchers for war and Soviet Union and the road and post-apocalyptic and Black Mirror. But let me tell you this, rationing, every economy is just based on rationing. How many of you here have a Ferrari? Well, Ferrari are rationed by price. So you can buy one if you have enough ticket to buy one. But if you go to La Poste to queue to send a letter, the rationing of access to the counter is by a queue, first come, first served. It's just a different, what we call protocol of allocation. So everything is always rationed. So somehow when we say that carbon is so important because it's limited and we want to reduce it, but on the other hand, we know that the well-being of many people depend on access to carbon, you're thinking, should we ration it by price like we ration Ferraris? So that people that have a lot of tickets, of money tickets, can burn a lot of carbon. I mean, we don't ration organs by price because we think it's too important. We don't ration access to health and education by price, or at least we used to. And so you could argue that certain things should be rationed politically, rationed through systems that are just higher than just market dynamics. So think of that. Today in the economy, who decides what to produce and how to produce it? These are the two most fundamental questions of economic organization. They're being asked every single day. They're being decided what to produce, how to produce it, what to produce, how to produce it. Municipality, companies, everyone is asking these questions. Today, these questions have been concentrated into managers, owners of companies, and especially shareholders who manage because they invest in companies to influence and to be, well, we want to concentrate our effort to produce things that can be sold for a lot of money. So we maximize our profit. So in a post-growth economy, you might want to democratize these decisions that already exist. It's called a cooperative with a stakeholder governance board with many different people around the table. And when you're asking what to produce, some people can be, well, this we might need. No one has the purchasing power to buy it, but those people really need it. And all the people out to produce it, then some engineers will be, well, I don't want to do planned obsolescence. Let's produce in a way that is nice, craft style. So we have all these complex discussions, which today we shortcut because we have this monopoly-like vision of the economy should be organized around the maximization of monetary indicators, GDP for government, profit for companies, and income for individuals. That is a very simplistic software. What I'm advocating here in a post-growth economy that will be a well-being focused economy and not a growth-based economy, we will need to have a dashboard of indicators. Social health, ecological resilience, well-being, economic prosperity if you want, but all of that integrated into dashboards. Where wealth is equitably shared, there is no way around it because inequality is not only detrimental to well-being, we know this from social science now, consensually, but it's also becoming a growth engine. So people that gather wealth invest it in order to get more wealth. So they invest in companies and then they get a say into what's to be produced, but that say they just often use to maximize their own wealth. People use wealth to buy apartments in Paris, for example, just to make more money out of their money. That creates unsustainable dynamics where these people slowly get more decision-making power over what to produce and how to produce it, which leads to bad decision-making and the, let's say, undervaluation of social value and ecological value. So we need to rethink the distribution of wealth and don't only think about just state redistribution. An economy, wealth travels in at least three ways: pre-distribution, distribution, redistribution. Pre-distribution is the way we split up property in the first place. If you find oil in your garden or a frog with a very interesting saliva molecule in its saliva that can be turned into medicine, who owns it? That's pre-distributive questions. Distribution is when you create added value in a company. You produce your medicine based on your super cool frog molecule. Who gets the money? The walkers, the indigenous people that were stewards of the forest where you found the frog, the shareholders that invested into the project, the state that maybe provided free education to the researchers that crafted the medicine. So that's a very political question that comes at the heart of political economy. Where does value come from? Who contributed to create that value? In a post-growth economy, we need to have institutions to better understand the contribution of social and ecological determinants of value. And so that leads us to redistribution. Of course, you can imagine in an economy where you have a better protocols of pre-distribution and distribution, you need to do less redistribution. I'm running out of time. So the last concept, in order to prosper without growth, the phrase from Tim Jackson's book in 2009, in the same way that during the transition, we need to maintain well-being. We can even sometimes improve it, but at least we need to maintain it. We need to transition by always having a look at not falling under certain social nets, because that's what an economy is for. An economy is to be able to satisfy needs, you know, in a way that with a parsimonious use of resources. So in the very long term, a growth-based economy is just not a very efficient economy, because it's just dependent on that patterns of growth. What you want is to have prosperity. What you want is a well-being economy. And what you want is an economy that can function, that can finance new activities, that can guarantee good quality public services, that can create the kind of jobs that you want without necessarily, you know, relying on the constant expansion of undesirable sectors and hoping that somehow you will, through tax a tiny bit of their value to invest in the things you want. So here there's a whole reflection around against indicators and what to replace GDP with. You may have heard of New Zealand in 2019 that replaces GDP with well-being budgets, 65 indicators of present and future well-being. So that might be an interesting initiative, and I would very much like Éloi Laurent has proposed it, to see a citizen convention on well-being, where you know, people at many different levels would just take the time to craft a new kind of indicator, not just one single button, like we're piloting the economy playing Tetris, but a dashboard with a lot of different indicators, which will allow us to have a more complex vision of prosperity than this kind of this kind of Santa Claus economic growth that is supposedly, you know, magically appearing and solving all of our problems. It's 42 minutes. So I think I'll stop here with that comment. If I've learned anything in my 15 years of studying economics, is that the economy is a game. It's a game we play. It's like Monopoly. It's like a giant game of Monopoly. Every single thing, the rules of that game, every single protocol, every single practice has been socially constructed. The Maastricht Treaty, the 2% inflation target, GDP itself, money in the way it's being printed, the way it's being created, the way it's being destroyed, every single thing. At some point, you had, usually a bunch of old dudes that studied economics, designed it. Today, we realize that that economy is no longer fitted to the reality of the 21st century. And so that is opening one of the most thrilling design challenge for us economists. So we're being upgraded from dentist to architect, which is pretty exciting. And I'm not only talking about economists, because that was the mistake, to just let economists discuss among economists, this kind of ancestral little discussion about, like, should it be 1% inflation, 3% inflation? And they did this for decades. We need to open up economics to interdisciplinarity. We need to redesign the economy with more than the analytical framework of economics. And this is why I'm very happy to have been invited here tonight to talk about this. And on that note, I think I can close up that presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Timothée. Now we're going to move into a bit of a more interactive moment. So given that this is organized by Situ, the Urban School Association, we thought it would be interesting to try to apply the concepts that Timothée shared with us to an urban context. And that's why we are going to propose to go again on WooClap and answer one question on how we can apply those degrowth principles to to urban areas. So here are a few ideas which Timothée and co-authors cite in a recent paper. There are a lot of different leverage points to act on production, consumption with the principles that Timothée cited. Acting on land and accessibility to it, the way we move around in cities, how we house people, and more generally, how we plan spatially our cities. So maybe what we can propose is to go on WooClap, right? Go on the same link as before. And if you want to brainstorm with your partners or your neighbors, and try to propose just in one sentence, or even if you want to take a bit longer to describe it, maybe one idea that you would have for an application of degrowth to urban policies. So that can be in any of the contexts cited before or other ones. So we'll give you a few minutes to think about that, and then look at the results.
Non, non, c'est parfait. Ouais. Très bien. Ouais. Enfin, moi, j'ai entendu plusieurs fois déjà le livre, mais je pense que c'est très clair avec les 5 éléments et puis le miroir.
Ouais, j'ai été au début. Est-ce que je dois... Go back to cul-de-sac. Ça te va si on te demande de réagir à quelques-unes des propositions? Ouais, bien sûr.
Et du coup, après ça, c'est les questions. Voilà. Et puis, normalement, le libraire, il arrive à 40. Ouais,
Bah, c'est chouette, ça fait plaisir que ça résonne. C'est partagé. Là, on fait. C'est juste cette question. On va un peu voir quelles sont les réponses et ensuite on ouvrira des questions plus générales. Là, il y a encore quelques personnes qui répondent. Alors, sur Zoom,
on montre les. Ah mince, oh là là, j'ai oublié les gens sur Zoom.
je sais pas.
Enfin, regarde s'il y a des gens sur le chat.
Il y a 25 personnes.
Du coup, tu fais ça et après tu montres un peu les. Ouais. Ok. Ah mince, attends, faut que... Ah mince, je l'ai fermé. Attends. Et je le laisse comme ça. Je laisse vérifier. Ouais.
All right, thank you very much. We've had a lot of submissions, which is really cool to see. So maybe we can go into looking at your ideas. It's a pleasure to see your enthusiasm. All right, so we had a lot of different submissions. I think a lot of them focused on housing. I saw a lot about sharing space within housing, limiting sprawl, limiting the use of land. Also community gardens. I saw someone putting brewing your own beer, which is a way of having a pleasurable degrowth method. But maybe Timothée, do you want to react to some of these proposals?
I mean, it would be rude if I said no. Let me start by the very important proposal that says, I really like your mustache. I think this is an underrated proposal. I'm very happy it's being discussed now. Circular economy. So that's very important. I prefer the concept of perma-circular economy from Dominique Bourg and Christian Asperger. That is coupling degrowth and circular economy. So see that as a spiral economy, because most countries and most cities have unsustainable metabolism. So you want to circularize, but you want to do it while also reducing production and consumption. To say it differently, circularization is not a substitute to degrowth. It has often in discourse today, it is people that work on circular economy, Ellen MacArthur Foundation style, propose circular economy as a way to bypass degrowth. So perma-circular economy, why not? Yes, absolutely necessary, and a post-growth economy should be as circular as possible. That makes sense. Bike sharing. So now that's something interesting about a mode of allocation. So remember, allocation is the way we transfer the kind of stuff we produce. 4 modes of allocation in political economy. You can just allocate based on the logic of the gift, like we do in the family and among friends. You can allocate in networks of reciprocity, Wikipedia, couchsurfing. You can allocate through state distribution, like we do for organs and taxes and education and healthcare, or you can allocate through market exchange. So here, that's a very interesting, when you think about, like, for example, okay, we want people to use more bikes. Okay, that's what we want. Or we want people to use more active modes of mobility. Always have in the back of your mind, is that going to be taking the form of a commodity? Meaning, for example, is that going to be a for-profit company that offers these scooters to people? Or are we going to organize this through the state, VELIB, or through self-organized commons like couch surfing or car sharing networks or stuff like this? Because these are going to have different consequences. Some are going to be more resilient than others. Some are going to have some growth imperative. If you entrust, for example, VELIB to a for-profit company, the day the system stops making profit, that company is going to go somewhere else, and that system is going to crash. So what else is there? That's very difficult just to comment on this on the spot. So 15-minute city I quite like. I think the concept of 15-minute city has to do with something that in feminist economics we call provisioning. So if you think about your day and it's 24 hours and you make a list of everything, all the goods and services you need to satisfy your needs of mobility, of housing, of everything in the matrix of fundamental human needs of Manfred Max Neef, for example. So very close to the notion of capabilities from Amartya Sen, then you can have a geographical mapping of these provisioning systems. So I need to have access to water in the morning to brush my teeth. Where is that water coming from? How long does it take for that water to come here? And then also you can add the economic layers. Is that water handled, managed by for-profit companies, that managed by a SKIC-like not-for-profit cooperatives, that managed by the municipality? All these kind of questions. So the provisioning approach often shows us that our economy has some inefficiencies, that in an economy where you want to reduce the use of fossil transport, it's not very smart for people to live in one side of the city and just to work in the other side with no access to quality public transport or active modes of transportation. So we need to rethink the 15-minute city is a good concept to look about provisioning, a provisioning that may be more efficient and also more pleasant, because I don't think anyone likes to commute in traffic jams to go to work. And okay, that allows me perfectly to introduce a concept from Ivan Illich. I remember the guy with the snail. Counterproductivity. So Illich wrote a book, for example, about mobility. A car makes you accelerate if you're the only one on the road. Going from A to B, it's faster to take the bike than to take your feet. But past a certain threshold of car concentration on the road, the car is going to slow you down because you're going to be in a traffic jam, because it's going to take an hour to park. And so you can calculate the general speed of a car, but taking into account the time you need to park it, the time wasted in traffic jam, and then you can go even to calculate the time you will need to work in order to earn the money to buy the car. A bike is less expensive than a car, and so therefore, you need to work less in order to buy it. There's also less money you need to spend in insurance, in repair, and all that kind of stuff. So we can calculate general speeds in a urban context to realize that the faster mode of transportation, the efficient mode of transportation, is not the one that allows us to accelerate. There's no point having a Ferrari in Paris. That's not going to help you to move faster. So when we rethink urban systems, we can always have also this notion of proportion and counterproductivity threshold. Should we open to question or just keep? Let's open to question.
Yeah, so we'll, if you guys want to raise your hands, if you have any questions, we'll bring the mic to you. And for people on Zoom, don't hesitate to write questions down. I see that there are already some. So yeah, I'll bring, so I saw someone right at the end at first.
Okay, yeah, it works. So hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a question about your point on the fact that degrowth had to be geographically selective. Of course, it's like undeniably good sense that degrowth needs to happen first in the north, like in northern countries, in Western countries that were the first to grow that much, and to let indeed the south reach a decent level of prosperity. That's definitely good sense. But I just wanted to ask you, don't you think that it's a bit naive or maybe even paternalistic to think that other countries, and notably the ones that are today developing at a fast rate, that they will stop where where degrowing asks for it, where the biosphere capacities ask for it, do you really think that they won't use 100% of the capacities to grow when they will have the cards in hands just the same way that we did? Because I don't really think that growing that much is intrinsically linked to Western civilization. I think that it happened because we could do it sooner than the others. And that's why we decided to go that far. So in that sense, how to decide of a threshold together with also the countries that are growing very fast to stop at a certain point? How are we going to convince countries like, I don't know, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, Egypt, etc., to also stop at some point? And also, just a sub-question in that is how to overcome the historical resentment towards the West when if we reach this degrowth, when we are going to try to convince them to do this, because we've been colonizing them, we've been patronizing them for so long time. So how are we going to convince them to do this now that they can grow, now that they can reach very high level of prosperity just like us? Thank you.
I see this as, I mean, if we use these resources in the global north, resources will be used anyway. If we burn the carbon now, it'll be burned. If we don't burn it and we degrow, then there might be a possibility that somehow it's not being used by another country. Maybe it will. But I don't think that the fact that someone else might use it is a good excuse for us to just keep monopolizing world resources. The work of Jason Hickel, his work on decolonial degrowth, I mean, what has been termed the imperial mode of living of the global north relies on massive imports of natural resources in the global south. So now I think the least we could do is not to tell other countries what to do, is just for us countries that have already reached that point where well-being is decoupled from economic growth, is to shrink our metabolism as much as possible, as to give them room to develop the kind of economy that they want. And that's, you know, degrowth comes from the post-development literature. And it points to what it's being called like the pluriverse. So pluriversal understanding of development, where people might be talking of Buen Vivir in South America, of Ecoswaraj in India, of Ubuntu in Africa, of many different visions of prosperity. So, and social movements around the world that protect their ecosystems and some aspect of their cultures of frugality, I think is a good demonstration of just the hegemony of Western capitalism has been like music played very, very loud. So now we can just tone down the music and remove the pressures to extract resources in the global south. And then in doing that, we can keep investing in coordinating efforts like at the level of the United Nations, what we've been doing with the COP. I'm not saying it's been very successful, but the logic is sound. The logic at the level of the COP was contraction and convergence, contracting emissions in rich countries so we can converge people being eradicated out of poverty and getting access to more resources. At this point, how is that going to happen? I think I'm passing the ball to political scientists, but it has too often been played as a discourse of climate delay to somehow say that, you know what, if we don't use the barrel of oil here in order to have SUVs and to fly on weekends and to eat more meat that is healthy for us to consume, the Chinese will do it. So we better do it. I don't think it stands as a very strong ethical argument. So what we need to do is just to coordinate and also somehow to design out this like rebound effect. So I give you just one single example that I really like. Ecuador in 2012 discovered a huge field of oil in the Yatsuni National Park, biodiversity hotspot. And they were like, okay, guys, we're going to extract it. And to extract it, we're going to destroy the park. So the president made an international announcement, was like, okay, we found X number of barrels of oil in the ground. We're going to crowdfund its preservation. If the international community gives us that amount of money, pay for the oil, we'll actually declare this a national park and we will never extract it. We'll keep oil in the soil. So that initiative didn't work because no one paid. But the logic I like, and I think these mechanisms of continuing, for example, in order to repay a climate debt for early industrial countries that keep paying for resources that don't get extracted, that don't get property over them, still the property, of course, of these countries. But these countries also guarantee with legal protection, for example, UNESCO patrimony. I mean, there can be many international standards to make sure that resources keep in the ground. So this could be one of the mechanisms that we could use.
So for me, it's more of a comment, and I'd just like to know what you think. And I think that the main problem for the global South is what comes after degrowth, is because right now the problem is, how do you create a new economy for a country like Pakistan that's currently mostly flooded? Are you going to take the economic model of climate adaptation that maybe the Netherlands has, or do you come up with something that's for you? Because for me, that's the problem. And I think not so many people are anxious to do what the West did, because they know that what the West did is clearly not sustainable. It's just, how do you come up with a new idea that is going to be accepted, like in the Ecuador example, and it will stay, or it will change at some point? I'd just like to know what you think.
Maybe we should take a few questions, then that forces me to have just shorter answers. But I've written that one down.
I also had just a quick question, or more like just asking your opinion on the model of donut economics and whether you think that that's the way forward.
Hey, so I got really excited about this, and I'm now impatient. So I'm like, okay, how do we get started? So my question was, since this is like a very transitional concept, did you already think about the first steps we can concretely take? And did you thought through a theory of change already? Like, yeah, like I'm in the present now, and I just, yeah, okay, it's good to think about the future, but we still live now, and I just want to know what steps we can take, and if you thought about that.
Hi, it's me, just the person in front of her. I have to ask, how old are you?
I'll write it down.
Oh. Okay, wait, hold on, I still have a question. My question is, I assume that many of us, if not most of us, will be contributing after we finish our programs to very growth-centric organizations, whether they be private or public. And I feel kind of like a sellout because I'm much more captivated by degrowth and by the argument that you're putting forward I just put money in your pocket, by the way. And I'm captivated by it, but I'm also kind of not looking forward to working, because I'd just be contributing to the problem as you've outlined. And so my question is, what are your suggestions? What are your ideas to get me out of this existential crisis?
One more.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick question as well. Well, maybe not quick to respond, but what would the role of borrowing and lending be in a degrowth economy, or like in a post-growth economy? Like, because we are not seeking to maximize capital, so then how would borrowing and lending change in this economy? Yeah.
Cool. So let me take them in order. So very often, yeah, I hear about like, in order to arm ourselves for effective climate adaptation. So for example, having like the flood protection that they have in the Netherlands, which as you can imagine are very expensive. And so countries, and I imagine Pakistan must have been thinking about this, to be like, we want the same means of protecting ourselves against the adverse impact of climate change. Actually, Pakistan need these tools much more than the Netherlands does. We agree on that. What I find strange is to argue that somehow we need to keep producing and consuming everything in the economy in order to somehow use some of that money to invest in the things we want. Like, why don't we use the full force of our economy to focus on the things that we really need urgently? And why we don't actually even shrink certain sectors of the economy in order to concentrate on that? You want a shocking fact? There are just as many people working in communication and advertisement in France that they are scientists. In time of impending ecological doom, why are we wasting so many hours of our more skilled creative people crafting internet ads for shampoo and SUVs? That's so, an economy is always just a finite number of hours, energy, materials, effort, attention. So my thing is, adaptation is going to be a huge task that we should not sacrifice mitigation for the sake of adaptation first. And then we should have adaptation as just first priority. And that's where I think international help is needed. Here I'm like an idealist in that sense. But I do think that if we buy into the story that somehow what Jason Hickel and his authors have shown, that a huge swath of the wealth we have in the global north result through what Marxian geographers David Harvey call accumulation by appropriation, which we could extend into a concept of appropriation by degradation. So somehow right now, the concept of a climate debt is so important because it means the cost of adaptation in the global south should be paid by the people who have most benefited from growing that economy and using the carbon that has contributed in warming the climate. And according to Jason Hickel, historically 92% of emissions are from high-income nations. So here we have a very important question of international redistribution of accumulated wealth. Donut economy, I like it very much so. Actually, I like the fact that people understand it, that it makes the idea of what we called before consumption corridors or other boring concept like this that didn't stick quite concrete. I like the fact that the city of Amsterdam and the city of Brussels have just taken the donut to rethink urban planning, and that the city of Amsterdam is rethinking all of its urban policies based on the donut. I think that's a huge step in the right direction. For those of you that know my work, and I know the work of Kate Raworth, you know, of course, that I disagree with the last chapter of her donut book, where she called herself an A-growther. But that very subtle, I think, disagreements. And so we have more in common than differences. And so for most of what is in the donut economy, I just agree. It's actually a figure that I use a lot to represent that biophysical obesity and to show something that economists have still not quite understood, that a sustainable economy, rendering an economy sustainable, is much more difficult than just decarbonizing an economy. Climate change is one problem among many. Greenhouse gases emissions is one, environmental pressures among many. And so we need donut approaches to see the plurality of ecological constraint. First step, theory of change. When I wrote the thesis, I was arrogant enough to think I could solve that question. So please never read chapter 12 of the thesis, because it's a mad chapter where I actually thought I could, after doing this inventory of instruments in the paper that was mentioned, we inventory 380 instruments. And in chapter 12, I'm like, yeah, it's like acupuncture. We just need to find the right order. And I'm like trying to represent this in conceptual models to see what changes are slow. If you want to build a windmill, that's 7 years. If you want to have a functional local currency, that's a 2-year delay. So you have to changes that are very slow, changes that are very fast, changes that are very local, changes that are very national. You have changes that requires other changes. If you want to give a basic income in a local currency, you need to have a local currency. So these kind of stuff. I don't think I've managed to quite see clarity in this. It's a mess. Every time you touch something in the economy, it's like a huge Rubik's Cube, something else changes. The problem with that Rubik's Cube, it's also on fire. So it's just very difficult to solve. And I find myself confronted with that very question you've asked, coming from very strange people. CEOs of companies, top government scientists, high public servant, ministers, chief economist of the Ministry of Economy, people that ask me, the Swedish PhD weirdo that just finished his thesis, how to reform the economy. The fact that they even ask the question shows how deeply into a dead end we are. So I think that shows the limits of concentration of decision making. So to see, I think I recommend to change the approach, and instead of just drawing that plan on paper, let's look at communities that have managed to transform their economy. We have more than 80 local currencies in France. How did they do it? What were the impact? We have shared garden, we have community supported agriculture, we have reciprocity network, shared object, we have Wikipedia, we have a social and solidarity economy, we have thousands of cooperatives, we have self-managed companies, we have alternative indicators of well-being, we have not-for-profit companies. Let's look at how they did it. And then I think when we see that, we can get a grasp of how do we connect all of these alternative bits of the puzzle to form a new economic model. I don't think it will ever appear on paper. So I suggest doing the opposite of what we've been doing in economics for the last decades, starting from reality, a constructor's theory from it, instead of just crafting a theory and imposing it on a reality that resists it. How old am I? It's a mystery that shall never be revealed. There's only one person in the room that knows. I'm 33. What to do when we find ourselves, in that situation? For me, there's not many things that give me optimism, but the call for desertion of recent graduates at AgroParisTech, I remember put a huge smile on my face. And I remember this because I felt in a similar situation when I started my PhD and people told me not to write about degrowth, told me do a PhD in just more mainstream economics, and then you get yourself in a position of power and then you'll change the system and blah, 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 blah. That doesn't work. I don't think I want to play the game anymore. So I like the AgroParisTech speech. I like call for desertion. I don't know if any of you have read Atlas Shrugged, a terrible book from Ayn Rand. I am ashamed of having read that full book when I was in second year of economics. Don't hold it on me. That was the vibe back then. In that story, it is the capitalist, the genius entrepreneur, the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos that just are too tired of creating wealth for all the leeches that we are. And so they desert and create their technological utopia in the sky. What we witness today is the opposite. Capitalism is just being emptied from the inside because no one wants to work for a system that just destroys the living world. So I think what we need to do is to organize the largest, most existential general strike capitalism has ever seen. And I've been seeing a lot of different people from companies, from huge companies, from corporations that would not like their names to be mentioned here, people in business schools and engineering schools and school of economics and government. And I'm having the same speech. I'm not diluting the ideas. I'm just giving them as it is. And I have found so little resistance. So I think we are all in that system and we think, oh, if I do this, I'll get fired. And other people, they'll think I'm a weirdo. It's very likely that someone else you work with is also thinking there is something wrong about having created these cookies on the internet. I still don't understand why they're here. So this is my call for desertion, which does not mean what some people say, oh, we should not desert. It does not mean we're going to create, you know, a good farm somewhere in the countryside. It means we're going to take control of the economy somehow. We're going to be like, no, we refuse to be a cog for this, but we also refuse to let you guys handle that very important things. So when it comes to economics, it means standing our ground, like for the idea of green growth, being like, if you don't show me that it's going to happen, I'm sorry, we're not doing it. It means somehow this suspicion of what we've been doing so far. This is what I've often told, you know, at debate, and because I'm so young, I get faced with old male economists, and they tell me, Tim, you know, I've been running the economy for the last 30 years. And I mean, yeah, so you're an expert in the destruction of the living world. That's a fantastic expertise and one I don't want. So we have an economy to invent. That's my favorite catchphrase. For decades, we've been trained in predicting the future of the economy. And now we need to do precisely the opposite and invent the economy of the future. And that is something that is just not written in economic textbook. Okay, that was a bit long, borrowing and lending. So now you're asking my sweet spot question, because at first I only wanted to write a PhD thesis about the role of money in a post-growth society, but that was just nobody wanted to finance that. But think about this. Now I'm mentioning Benoît Boritz and Bernard Friot, two old white economists also, but they've designed an interesting system where, imagine the way we finance social security. So we all cotize, we put a bit of our wages on the side, which we use to pay for general expenses regarding health, retirements, this kind of stuff. Imagine if we had the same, not a social security, but an economic security. All companies put a bit of their added value, a bit of their profit on the side in an investment fund. So a collective investment fund, and when another company needs to invest into something, it can use some of that fund. Some companies might not need to invest now in the same way that you might not need a new kidney or to go to the hospital now. But then we would have the very same system we have now. We would be able to mobilize available resources to invest into certain things. Macroeconomically, it's the very same thing. The only difference is in that system, we can have a democratic protocol to decide what to invest in first. Compared to today, when you want to invest in something, you need to convince rich people that they must invest in it. And that, I get invited by a lot of investment funds. You know, I get them off the phone and they make me sign non-disclosure agreement and kind of stuff. And then they ask me this very childlike question, and they're like, yeah, degrowth, cool. How do we invest in it? I'm like, well, guys, let me break it to you. You're going to invest your money there. You're going to create social and ecological values, but the bees are never going to give you your money back. They don't have wallet. They don't have Lydia. They're going to swish you. And then they're like suddenly less interested in this. And they're like, oh, okay, cool, but we'll just invest in green economy, renewable energy, stuff like this. So here we see that the concentration of wealth in a growth-based economy where we have this narrative of success defined as who can manage to get the most money out of the money they already have is going to be an obstacle to all the necessary investment we need to make to repair what has already been degraded. Again, to bring back healthy biodiversity into cities, to bring back, you know, stuff that has been destroyed, like the ability of trees to cool down a city. All of that, who's going to pay for it? For these nature-based, you know, ventilation system, trees, basically. We need to make a public choice. Like, we need to invest in this, and that's going to benefit. It's going to create positive externalities. But private investors, they're never going to be interested into this. So we need to rethink the entirety of the monetary system, of the banking system, of the financial system. That's chapter 11 of the thesis for nerds among you that want to do something cool this weekend.
Great. Thank you so much, Timothée. Thank you so much for coming to Sciences Po tonight and for sharing a little bit about your work and your new book with us.